Tonight, whom I'll ask to introduce herself.
Yes, good night, everyone. My name is Tranaya Douglas, and I am currently the Women's Programming Officer, Gender Field Officer at the Department of Gender Affairs here in St. Kitts. Could I go more into what that means?
Sure.
So essentially, that means I deal with more of the women's affairs. For lack of a better term, I focus on like domestic violence rehabilitation, gender-based violence and gender activism, advocacy, anything surrounding women's rights, really. So yeah.
Cool. Thank you for that introduction. And just to say, as you were talking, I was like, let's make sure to insert that there are officers, or at least one officer, who deals with like men and boys.
Yes,
and
there is a male officer. No, because that's what I was like, for lack of a better term,
Yeah.
because because people usually associate gender affairs with women's affairs, so it's not only that's just the portfolio that I have.
Yes. And it's actually, anyway, I'm not going to get into like the nerdy side of it, but the evolution from, women's affairs to women and development, to women in development, gender and development, all of those things. But the Caribbean especially, I feel like, does a good job of good enough job of at least recognizing the importance of addressing everybody who lives in this space, particularly when it comes to the departments or the government machinery that deals with gender. Anyways, so tonight we're talking about 16 days of activism. Can we start with the theme? I'm always unsure what that is. But yeah, let's start with the theme for this year's 16 days.
Okay, so this year the theme is #push forward, invest in violence against women and girls. And for me, at least, that means when we hear the word invest, we normally think about money, but I just think for me, what it means is at least investing the time to at least acquaint yourself or educate yourself with the topics surrounding gender-based violence, which kind of ties into the approach that I decided to tackle this year with our 16-day campaign.
Okay. And we'll get to the campaign, as we continue to talk about it. But before we get into the campaign, because actually I was in a conversation earlier and I mentioned that my topic tonight was about the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, and somebody asked me, what is that? So they're not familiar with the campaign, but I think there are lots of people who aren't even familiar with the term gender-based violence and what that means. So can you give us a short definition and then tell us what some of the different forms of gender-based violence
are? Gender-based violence simply is exactly what it sounds like. It's violence, violent acts being committed against a gender. I wouldn't say there's a specific gender it's attributed to, but however, women and girls are disproportionately affected by it, so they tend to experience more severe acts of violence than any other gender. And I think that how it differs from domestic violence is that domestic violence is essentially, it focuses, or at least by the Domestic Violence Act here in St. Kitts and Nevis, focuses on intimate relationship, partnerships, or family members, someone you've lived with or been in an intimate relationship with specifically. So it's not just about your gender, it could be a family member, intimate partner, or something like that. So that's pretty much the difference between the two.
Okay. And what about the different forms of gender-based violence? Because I know it can show up in different ways, sometimes to the point where people might be a victim of gender-based violence and they don't even know. So what are some of the different forms of gender-based violence?
I would say the main one, is more of a subset of gender-based violence. So it would be, domestic violence would be a subset of gender-based violence because it is a form of it. And in that, I think that like I said, gender-based violence, it just doesn't happen to one specific gender, but it might disproportionately affect one more than the other. So I guess more towards women and girls, or towards boys, trans men, trans women, that type of thing. I don't think I could say like the specific term for that, but I know based on who it may be directed to, right? So I think when we talk about, like, going back to the subset of domestic violence, I would say that there's different types of domestic violence or abuse associated with that. So there's physical, mental, economic or financial, psychological, which is also mental, as well as social. So those are just a few. I feel like I'm missing something, but that's what's coming to my head right now. So I guess those would be the different types of violence or abuse.
Okay. Can you say more about how, or maybe this is for another, because I feel like talking about how somebody can recognize signs in their relationships is a whole other topic, but maybe we could talk about, based on some of your clients, what are some of the common manifestations you see? Is it mainly physical violence? Is it mainly financial or economic violence? What do you typically see in your clients?
Okay, so just for clarity, being the women's programming officer, when I deal with domestic violence clients, it's more so in a space of rehabilitation. So
not the intake.
No,
okay.
I don't have the intake. So that would be the case manager.
Yeah. Okay.
So she essentially, so like sometimes I might sit in on a session just to get an idea, but not all the time. But I could say from my experience of doing that, I think it just depends on the individual, because that's one of the things about domestic violence that I think is kind of like where the stigma comes from, because people don't really understand what it entails, and that's why we listed like the different types of abuse, because each relationship is different and it might manifest differently. So you might be in an abusive relationship where verbal abuse, so that was one of the ones that I didn't mention. So verbal abuse is something where you berate your partner constantly, you say harmful things to them, you will know it will cut them deep, right? Whereas like there's like physical abuse, everyone knows what physical abuse is, but then there's always also like property. So it could be damage to your person, damage to your property. Social abuse, controlling who your partner gets to see, trying to control a narrative of your partner and how they interact with other people, who they interact with. Psychological, so manipulation, gaslighting, and economic. So if your partner is, I guess, say, the breadwinner of the household, they control the funds, and control you essentially.
Yeah, I think those, even though you said you might not necessarily know them firsthand as since you're not the case manager, I think those were still really good examples. Of course, not exhaustive, and as you mentioned, it depends on the relationship. And I was just thinking about, first of all, we unfortunately live in a very violent society, and as you said, a lot of times when we think about violence, we think about physical violence, but there's verbal abuse. There's so many types of violence that many of us just grow up with by virtue of living here. Okay, go ahead. You want to say something?
No, go ahead. I was on WinFM back in September with Socrates, and somebody called in and they mentioned another type of violence that for me I never heard personally, and they referred to it as polite violence. And when I first heard it, I was like, my brain started like going. So I was like, what does that mean? So they started talking more about like real life examples as it pertains to, if somebody does something that would be considered rude, but it's in a very passive aggressive way. So you kind of if you react out like against it, then you would be considered the aggressor. But that's the type of polite violence, but it's more normalized in society. So then I was like, wow, like people do a lot of like subtle acts of violence just by saying certain things, which I guess that still kind of ties back into like verbal abuse as well. But I guess in that case it wouldn't necessarily be domestic, because it's not, well, depending on the situation, it might not be with an intimate partner or family member, but just someone around in society. So it's really something, it's so interesting to look into. So polite violence is no term.
Very interesting.
Yes.
And yeah, I think that those are things that happen a lot, particularly in cases where, you know, people don't have conflict resolution skills or emotional intelligence, like where there's a gap with certain soft skills in particular. But outside of that, I think, you know, just the way that we raise children, the way that we interact with children is very violent, the way that we interact with each other. So it's like, you know, adding to the inability to recognize some of these things. Like, it's harder to recognize something as harmful if you've grown up with it as normal. Right? And I think that is the case for a lot of people. And as you were talking about things like damaging property, I remember I was reading something about this relationship where the guy just would do small things like break the partner's like favorite mugs and like just consistently, or like they would always go missing, and it turns out that like they were intentionally, so they weren't causing harm to the person, but they were willfully, you know, messing with things that they knew the person liked. So I think it also applies to, like, you know, if you have something that is your favorite thing, you know, if somebody else decides to claim ownership of that, you know, like there are so many, as you said, you know, subtle forms that you might not recognize or might not want to term that. So yeah, those were, I think, a good intro to the forms of gender-based violence and how they might manifest.
I guess, like, now that I thought about it a little bit more, I did go into like the different types of domestic violence, abuse, and yes, it is considered abuse. But then when you asked me earlier about the different types of gender-based violence, they basically can be the same, because then you have sexual violence.
And there's, I was gonna add sexual violence,
So I think maybe just because I talk about it so much, I talk more about domestic violence. But so those are the same things that could be attributed to gender-based violence, but they just show up differently, because then with like I said, sexual violence, it would be rape, sexual assault, stuff like that. It still would be economic, psychological. Those are still acts that you could commit against another person. So it would essentially be the same things, but they just wouldn't necessarily be abuse, because I think the term abuse, when we use the word abuse, it sounds more consistent. It's something more repeated, like drug abuse. So I think it would be more something being exacerbated, repeated over and over again, whereas like something like violence, it could be a single act. Which most cases, which is weird, because when we talk about that, like a lot of when acts like that are committed against women, is usually somebody you know. It's usually not a stranger. It's usually somebody closer to you. Higher numbers for that, the statistics actually show. So
okay, what about some common myths or misconceptions about gender-based violence?
That's lovely asking that, because that actually goes into the myths and facts, myths versus facts poll on domestic and gender-based violence that I have going right now for the 16 days campaign. So some of the questions, well, an example is like people actually thinking that only women experience domestic violence, or it only is a woman thing, or it's a woman issue, that domestic violence is like a private issue. It's not something you should talk about with other people. It's a private matter. Another myth, I guess I could say, is it only happens in poor, uneducated households or families, relationships.
Like it only happens to certain people. Yeah.
It only happens to certain people, certain demographic, certain gender. What else? Another myth. I guess. What's another myth for domestic violence? Oh, that if it's so bad, the person will just leave the situation very easily. Like, they could just leave if it's so horrible. Yeah, so that's another one.
Okay. I guess I shouldn't ask you to go into the facts because then that would give away.
Yeah.
That would give away the answers.
Well, yeah, because I guess it would skew the results.
Yes, we could come back after to talk about some of the facts, but just to say that those are all. Yeah. Those are all among the myths. What about, because some of these myths and misconceptions, actually most of them are fueled by culture and cultural attitudes, traditions, the ways that we think and believe and so on. So how do cultural traditions and attitudes influence the prevalence of gender-based violence in our society?
So many ways. The hyper-masculinity, toxic masculinity, I think it permeates a lot through our traditions.
You have to say more about that, of course.
Yes. So to go deeper into it, we talk about toxic masculinity. I said like hyper-masculinity. It just kind of refers to, if you heard the term patriarchy, and how that system has kind of like been embedded, not just in St. Kitts but in a lot of other places in the world, and how it kind of permits that advantage for men to succeed, and but at the same time I don't believe it's just a good thing for men. I think it also is detrimental to them as well, as much as people think it benefits them, but a lot of people don't know that it's just as harmful to men as it is beneficial. So yeah, I feel like they say, it's a man's world, but I don't know. I think it really means that with our culture, we have traditional gender norms, and that's just like, the typical man being the breadwinner of the household, the woman being the stay-at-home mother, or even if she, I guess, does have a job, it's not a typical role that, woman, well, it's the typical role a woman is expected to have. So whereas like if I, the stigma of if I tell you, oh, there's a doctor here to see you, if the first person that's gonna pop into it is a man or a woman, so it's just the socialization of how we've been taught, or the stereotypes associated with certain roles, gender roles specifically. Because when you think about a construction worker, for example, the first person you don't think about is a woman, or you don't think about, when you think about somebody working in a bank, depending on if it's the CEO or if it's a bank teller, you probably think it's two different genders, or even a pilot. You think it's probably a white or Caucasian male. So it just, I guess all of those factor into like different schemas, gender schemas, gender stereotypes, and traditional gender roles that permeate in this society. You want me to go more into that?
Yes, I'm sure you can talk about any other cultural, or how any other ways that cultural attitudes and traditions can affect how much gender-based violence happens. It's normalized.
I think it's reinforced in the sense that I think the actual general gender stereotypes are heavily reinforced here. Women being weaker than men. I mean, it is true biologically in certain cases, not all the time, because there's situations where their female counterparts do meet their male partners, which is another thing that would happen where men wouldn't be taken seriously because like how a woman could beat you up. So that's just another thing embedded in our society. We don't think that a woman is capable of doing that. And if some, I guess, like men would be justified in it, okay, if the woman did something that isn't favorable, like talk to another guy, or they see them talking to another guy, that goes back to the toxic masculinity, because the insecurity and like, oh well, if you woman talk to the next man, you can't control your woman. So it's just like thinking the man has control over the woman in general, and she can't think for herself essentially, or he's the provider, so essentially because he provides, he's the one who leads, the man is the leader, or the woman just kind of there to follow and do whatever it is to please him. So I guess that all ties into the cultural norms of what is expected in traditional gender roles here, and how it could manifest, as you say, into gender-based violence, because it might justify some of the behaviors to certain men or women as to what they believe is a part of our culture.
Yeah, it's also so interesting because sometimes, because we know, like, the statistics here show that I think the majority of our households are headed by women, and usually single women. But I also know that sometimes when you go wrong and you ask, who is the head of the household, even though it's a single woman who is the head of a household, she would still put down some man's name or whatever. It's also the way that the eldest son, especially if you lose the father or uncle or whoever, like, becomes the head of the household, the man of the house, despite regardless of the person's age. So they are now able to determine what will happen to women who are even older than they are in the household. It's also, as you talked about the norms and the expectations, like, I remember kind of having it, being reminded, like, whether it was jokingly or whatever, like being told, okay, once you know how to cook, like, your husband, your man is not gonna beat you, and things like that. And it's just the way that we set up environments that are conducive to violence, where it's like, and it comes back to what I was talking about with raising children, because it was like, if you do X, then you won't get B. And that transfers over into adulthood. And one of my missions in life, I don't know if I'll accomplish it, is getting that part, that connection to stick. That what happens in childhood, the violence that children experience or see in childhood, often turns out to be violence that they perpetrate in adulthood or experience again. They become victims again in adulthood. That's like one of my life's mission, to like get that connection, that cycle, the awareness of that cycle is sick, but I don't know if it's gonna happen. But
hopefully, we can only hope, right?
Hopefully. I guess
it's kind of insulting in a way. Well, it is insulting because when we talk about like the man of the household thing and the child is much younger, like the boy, but yet there's a fully grown adult being the mother in the household. So it's like saying she's not capable of maintaining the household, but a 15-year-old boy somehow magically is, just because he was born with male genitalia. So I don't know. I just think it's just, there's not a lot of logic to these things associated with these gender stereotypes when you really think about it. So I don't know. It's just one of those things. And if you really think about it now in 2024, there's more women educated than men. And really and truly, women don't even really need men a lot anymore, because we could do a lot of things ourselves. We could call somebody else to it. Back then, women actually kind of let's say, needed a man because men had more rights to do certain things. Women weren't probably allowed to do certain things before, but now women don't really need men in the household to do things for them. They could vote, they could, cook, clean. And it's funny you mention like the cooking aspect, because I like to call that like performing gender. And what performing gender means is just exactly what it sounds like. Acting like what you think your role is as a male or female, or man or woman. So I just think that as you perform from like a small age, as you're getting to adulthood, you're conditioned to think that, oh, if I don't do XYZ, I won't get a husband, or I won't be married, I won't get a boyfriend, this person won't like me, yada yada yada. Whereas a man, like, is not really taught to settle down. Essentially, they're taught to kind of be promiscuous.
So their seeds.
So
all those things.
Oh yeah, you could get a child so you could carry on your legacy, but somehow you getting the child discards the person that you're creating the child with and the potential relationship that you could have cultivated with that said person to raise the child in a more cohesive environment. But it's almost like women just seen as like the birthing banks, but we're not seen as actual human beings, just tools.
Yeah. Once I read that women, the thing described women as disposable receptacles for semen.
Oh my gosh.
So, kind of, and that's also why women are the objectification, and that's why women and girls tend to be disproportionately affected by violence as well. It's the value that is placed or not placed on women and girls. It's the roles that people perceive them to have, which you mentioned are usually like, the lesser roles, like roles that are more focused on care and things in general that we devalue. So
it's so counterproductive though, because
it's like patriarchy.
We not seen as equals or really human beings, because we said gender based, it's not a woman's issue, it's a human rights issue, because without women, where would you be? And I just think that the reason I say it's counterproductive is because if women are being socialized to be good and be modest and demure
and
cutesy and that, like, we're being raised to be these perfect humans in society that wasn't created for us anyway, which means we got to go work twice as hard. But then boys, they really don't have to do much, and nobody telling them you need to be demure or you need to have some decorum or do anything. They don't. They do the complete opposite. So, but then it's like, if you're raising your boys and the men to be like that, how do those two things come together?
They
don't. So it's like, how are you allowed to be like, I don't even know a word to use for that, like, as we say, it gets out of order, right? And then with girls, it's like, oh yeah, you must be modest, you must be demure, as you say. So I just don't see the connection, because then when you grow up and you meet somebody or a man who embodies, what it means to be a toxic male, someone who really is very traditional in a very conventional way, it's like, okay, I was not raised like this. And if God forbid a woman be liberal and have a voice and actually like understand what it means to what stereotypes are, what toxic masculinity is. Oh no, she's speaking out against this and she's a threat to society. I don't get that. It's not compatible.
It's another or similar irony is the expectation that boys would be very virile and fertile and have a lot of sex, but that women should be virginal. So it's like, if boys are expected to have a lot of sex but women are expected to be virginal, then who are the boys
who are they having this sex with?
So like there are a lot of expectations and norms, and you mentioned that the norms really aren't grounded in logic. I feel like that's norms.
It's
like people just come up with things, and that's also something, for folks to remember, that all of these things that we believe or accept or whatever now are just things that people before us just came up with, like they're not
people that don't exist anymore. You never met, probably.
Yeah.
Most likely. So, but you just follow blind faith.
Yeah, even though a lot of the things don't work for us, never worked for most people. Because you talk about patriarchy, you talk about certain versions of masculinity. Those versions of masculinity were never created with black men, in particular. Caribbean men. They were never created with certain men. I mean, it was like a white male model of a certain body type, a certain class, a certain culture, a certain location. A lot of those norms just never work for us because they were never created for us. So it's for men to the expectations that men will be the single sole breadwinners, and those things stopped working for us for years now because financially them things just ain't possible, right? So it's like it's moving into versions of masculinity also, when you talk about men needing to hold their emotions in and be strong and stoic and never tell nobody how you're feeling. That makes you like half of a human being, right? It's like everybody wants to be able to express their emotions. So it's also like apply to men. We're talking about 16 days of activism against violence. Like, think about the ways that you may have experienced or witnessed violence growing up or around you, and how that might have affected your own treatment, the way that you yourself approach people and think about violence and challenge how maybe it's become normal. Because we don't I feel like I've seen a lot of relationships where especially heterosexual relationships where people just abuse and fight on a normal and it's like you throw hands, I throw hands back, we both fight, tussle all the time.
It's fear because we both get away.
And sometimes I even hear people talk about, I gonna hit back whoever, and it's like the expectation is that violence will happen and you're just prepared to respond to it it's
as if it's a form of justice.
And that it makes it okay, right? And that it makes it more acceptable because at least I'm fighting back, as opposed to recognizing that a non-violent option is
available.
Right? Anyways, that was
so much points to be made.
Except
going back to the inconsistency, you talked about the patriarchy, and like I mentioned earlier, women right now are leading in terms of education and higher pay, and somehow, like you said, the patriarchy was really made for a specific demographic of men, North American, cisgendered. So it's so funny how I feel like here we adopt, let me say our culture kind of adopts this traditional American model in a way, the conservative way. So
we're very conservative.
Very conservative here, but it's very controversial.
We wouldn't call ourselves conservative.
We wouldn't, which is weird, but when you really think about it,
we wouldn't align publicly with Republicans and stuff. No, but continue.
But that's what I'm saying, the inconsistency, because we follow that model, But somehow the patriarchy is meant to serve men, and if we're following that model, that isn't working for the men here, especially because it's Caribbean black men, right? But women are still winning in those areas. It's harder for us because we get the fight down, yes, but statistics still showing we're going hard, we're doing what we need to do, but somehow we still fighting against those odds. We're still beating a lot of those odds in a lot of different arenas right now in the 21st century. So what are the men doing? If it's so created and this model is so working for you, you ain't working. So how is it working for you, right?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to make sense.
Yeah. Okay. So in that vein, and as we, approach the end of the show, let's go into some of the things that the ministry is doing, or the department is doing for the 16 days of activism.
Okay, so this year I decided to do more of a online approach. I don't think it's ever been done before previously. I've only been with the department for a year, so I just felt like it was a good way to kind of engage the younger population, because when you're thinking about gender affairs or gender-based violence, domestic violence is not a sexy topic. So it's not, when we think about the audience that we're trying to reach, in some ways it's not always as easy for us as, let's say, maybe a department like creative economy, because with that you're calling people interested in the arts, and even if you're talented, you want to see who talented and you want to tune in, and maybe there might be something in it for you. I think with gender affairs though, we offer very specific offer. It talks about what gender, if you're familiar with the campaign, or I want to say the campaign, not just my social media campaign, but just the campaign in general, because it is an international campaign, and it just tries to give us an idea of how much the general public knows about what we do, what the department does, what the initiative is about, how is it reaching them. So we could just get a small little idea of like, is it reaching people, where they're getting the information from. I also have 2 more activities. It's the domestic violence myth versus fact poll, so that mentions like some of the questions with myths. It's all of them very short, and it's a very educational poll, so when you answer it, it actually tells you what the correct answer is and what the fact is, if it's a myth, that type of thing. So it actually breaks it down for you. So even if you might have said, okay, well, I think this is a myth, it would say, well, it's actually a fact, and this is why it's a fact. So it's not like you're just getting wrong just to say you're wrong. You're actually being educated in the process. And then since our minister, Honorable Isaiah Phillip, she was able to they had an amendment, they passed an amendment bill in November 2022 for the Domestic Violence Act, which has, well, the purpose of it was to make the domestic violence services, and especially when it comes to the court, more accessible for everybody being affected by it. So it asks questions about that and what people think it's about, and then at the end it tells them if they're right, wrong, what the right answers are, that kind of thing. So it's just to get them acquainted with our law. Let's see what people think about the myths surrounding domestic violence and the services the department offers. So it really gives you like a breakdown of all the different areas that we're really trying to focus on. So I just felt like it was a good way to let them learn about us, learn about the law, learn about the services, and pretty much everything. So because it's all about awareness really at the end of the day. So that was the best way I thought we could do it. So
Okay. Anything else you want to share about this 16 days of activism campaign? So
it's not just online activities. So I actually have spoken. Well, I'm going to speak, and I did speak previously last week at an event, Music and Monologues, at Shadwell Great House. And then I think the Mothers Union on Sunday wanted me to come speak about that in the Anglican Church in St. Peter's. So it's just advocacy in general. And then on Friday, we do have a legal aid pop-up clinic. So essentially what that'll be is a way to get free legal advice from one of our partners, a lawyer. She's a gender champion, Taliba Byron. She was also one of our past International Women's Day awardees, as well as a sergeant from the police force here in St. Kitts, myself, and I think someone from the counseling, National Counseling Center within the ministry, as well as a child probation and protection unit officer as well. So anything with that, like surrounding those issues, and you have questions, you could just come and you talk to us and you get the advice and the resources that you need. And we have set it up in a way so that with the more legal affairs, it's more private. And it's gonna be on the 42nd Street in Sandy Point town. So we blocked off that road, so we'd be able to set up the tent and have our little, thing there. Anything else? Just links. If you want to get involved with the activities online, we have a link tree, so that houses all of our links to our social media as well as the activities. So the link for that is linktr.ee/DEPT gender KN. Again, that's linktr.ee/DEPT gender KN. And we also have a WhatsApp Gender Equality Hub channel. So you don't have to talk in it. It's just something you could follow. It's anonymous. You don't know who in there. But you just get updates with our flyers and events and links to everything. So once you're following it, that's all you have to do. Just click follow, and you could actually search it up with Tiny, like tinyurl.com/genderhubkn. Again, tinyurl.com/genderhubkn.
Okay. Let's go back to the clinic. So what time is the clinic? And you said it's in Sandy Point?
Yes, it's on Friday, 42nd Street, Sandy Point, from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m.
Okay. So this is separate to another advertisement I've been seeing for a legal aid clinic that I think is being put on by the Bar Association. Okay.
I didn't even actually know about that till last week, because I saw a friend of mine post about it, but I didn't know about it before we had planned ours.
Okay.
So I just thought, the more the merrier. They did it in town, we do anything good.
Yes. Yeah. So that's also a good move, because a lot of those kinds of services never leave Bastia. So It's good to take it to a different community. So that's in Sandy Point. It's 42nd Street on the main road or off the main road? Can you give us directions?
It's that road, you see if you know where Charles E. Mills Secondary is, it's that road when you turn on left.
Or the road that little veers off, okay, and off of the main road. Okay,
yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's what my director told me. I've been there
but
before.
It should be, and you all will have signs, and it should be obvious enough when you're around there. Okay. I think those are all really good ideas, especially bringing it to the public. Now that you explain it, I have a lot. I have a better understanding of the intentions behind it and so on, because I was in Antigua recently, and I went to a play which was called The 18th Year, based on a book, Surviving a Narcissist. I think it's a recent-ish book.
I heard about that book before.
Okay, yeah, so and they're doing an encore, I think, early next year. If anybody wants to go to Antigua for the play. Anyway, but in that example, and other examples too, I find a lot of times when we're talking about gender-based violence, Caribbean people, we make joke out of anything. And sometimes it's the laughing is ill-timed. And the lightness of it, it's okay. The lightness of it is kind of confusing. So when I saw the quizzes and so on, I was will this potentially make folks think that it's just about winning prizes and things like that. But when you like explain it and explain its purpose and the information that it's seeking to provide and so on, I'm like, yes, please. Like, you can use the incentive of a prize, but actually learn something.
Yeah, I think that, like I said before, one of the first things I said was like, you said gender affairs, like the topic is not a sexy topic.
Yeah.
So it was for me just trying to see, when you mentioned the word domestic violence, people like, domestic violence? So how was I going to draw attention? How was I going to say give people attention to even sit down, to even fill out anything that was in it for me?
Yeah.
So that was that's why I provided the incentive and kind of dress it up, because I felt like it would have been easier for people to be like, okay, well, ain't gonna hurt to just do it, I might win some. But at the same time, they're still learning even something they didn't know before. And even if they didn't like take any of the quizzes, if they didn't know agenda affairs existed, they don't know.
Yeah.
And they probably click on the link tree and see like they went on with Facebook, and the website link is in there. They could check. So it's really like, even if they didn't fill out the activities, I designed it in such a way so that people could still click and search, because people ask anyway.
Yeah.
So they're gonna just search and do their own research, and if it's the information is now readily accessible, because people don't even know we have a website. People don't even know what we do. So that way you could find out what we do, even if you don't feel like participating.
Yeah. Yeah. That's definitely fair. So yeah, I think it's a good way to attract folks, and for folks brand awareness, but also like take it seriously, and send it to people, and you could use it as a conversation starter, like you could fill it out.
Exactly. So it starts conversations, get people thinking things that you might have thought was true. The poll might have break that down, that way of thinking down, or maybe have you thinking differently. Maybe you're questioning your friends, or trying to look more into certain things, so you really don't know how it's sparking the ideas, or like the you don't really know how it's affecting people. And it could be positive, maybe it might be negative, I don't know, but hopefully it's more positive than that. But yeah, so I just feel like it's a good thing in general. Yeah. So it's not just all fun, but I had to do something so I could look.
And okay, got you, making it attractive. And of course there'll be more things. I mean, the department is always doing work. This is just specific to this campaign, which ends on the 10th.
Yeah, so it ends on the 10th, but the quizzes close on the 9th at 11:45 p.m.
Okay, so it ends on the 10th, and after that you will continue to do the work continues.
The work continues behind the scenes, but winners should be contacted by the 12th. That's a Thursday, so that's in the same week.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
All right. So.
And the raffle is optional, so it wasn't something where I was just like, oh, you do it. And the activities themselves are anonymous. I really don't know who filling them out. I mean, the raffle part isn't anonymous, but it's not tied to the activities, so I can't tell which question or which respondent you were in any of the activities. I just know you're entering the raffle.
Okay, that's an important note, so you can trust that confidentiality is maintained. So tonight we had a conversation about, and I'm thinking of it as I mentioned, as like a part 1, because 16 days runs for 16 days. So we'll hopefully have another part of this conversation where we will talk more about resources that are available. I want to get into more about how men and boys can be engaged and help to prevent gender-based violence, but especially like the resources available and things on the response side. So we will get into that conversation next time. But as usual, I'm so happy that you were able to join us tonight as we talked about gender-based violence and its connection to kind of sex. But yeah, I think it was a really interesting conversation. It's always interesting to talk about these kinds of topics as heavy as they are. And I hope that it has sparked some reflection and that it will spark some conversation for you all watching and listening going forward. Do you want to add anything about like how people can contact the department?
Yeah, so you could contact the department either by 467-1275 or 1254, extension 1254.
Okay, thank you. So with that said, I will see you all next time. Thank you so much for joining, and I'm wishing you a pleasurable evening as usual. Bye.